For most of the time our genus has existed on this planet, being human wasn't a one-species situation. As recently as 50,000 years ago, depending on exactly where you happened to be standing, you could have shared a continent with at least 3 or 4 genuinely different human species at the same time. Some of them taller than us, some of them shorter than a modern 10-year-old, some of them with brains larger than ours, and at least one of them we only discovered existed because of a single, unassuming finger bone found in a cave in Siberia. Homo sapiens being the only human species left on Earth isn't the normal state of affairs for our genus, it's actually the weird, lonely exception. Let's start with the one most people have at least heard of, Neanderthals. Despite generations of pop culture treating them as lumbering, dim-witted brutes, the actual scientific picture that's emerged over the last few decades looks almost nothing like that outdated caricature. Neanderthals had brains that were, on average, slightly larger than modern human brains, used sophisticated tools, controlled fire, buried their dead with apparent intentionality, and recent evidence even suggests some degree of symbolic or artistic behavior, cave markings in certain Spanish sites that predate any known arrival of Homo sapiens in that specific region. Neanderthals weren't some failed evolutionary draft, they were a successful, technologically capable human species that thrived across Europe and parts of Western Asia for several 100,000 years, considerably longer than Homo sapiens has currently been around as a distinct species ourselves. And here's the detail that tends to genuinely surprise people once it actually clicks. Neanderthals didn't go extinct in some ancient, distant geological era completely disconnected from us. The most recent Neanderthal remains date to somewhere around 40,000 years ago, meaning Homo sapiens and Neanderthals coexisted in the same regions for tens of thousands of years. That's not a brief, awkward overlap. That's an extended period where two distinct human species were navigating the same landscapes, competing for the same resources, and, as genetic evidence has now firmly established, occasionally doing considerably more than just coexisting. Genetic research has confirmed that modern humans of non-African descent carry measurable amounts of Neanderthal DNA, typically somewhere between 1 and 2% of the genome, evidence of interbreeding events that occurred when Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa and encountered Neanderthal populations already established across Europe and Asia. This genetic legacy isn't just a historical curiosity either. Researchers have found that some inherited Neanderthal gene variants appear to influence modern immune system function, skin pigmentation, and even certain aspects of fat metabolism, suggesting these genetic contributions provided real, tangible adaptive advantages that helped Homo sapiens populations survive in environments Neanderthals had already been adapting to for considerably longer. Now let's bring in a species that genuinely upended scientific understanding of human diversity almost overnight, Denisovans. Unlike Neanderthals, who left behind a substantial fossil record collected over more than a century, our entire knowledge of Denisovans initially came from a single, tiny fingerbone fragment discovered in Denisova Cave in Siberia in 2010. Researchers extracted genetic material from that fragment expecting to find either modern human or Neanderthal DNA, and instead found something genuinely unprecedented. A distinct genetic signature, unlike either known human lineage, representing an entirely separate human species nobody had previously identified through fossil evidence alone. This is genuinely one of the wildest moments in recent paleoanthropology, an entire previously unknown human species, confirmed almost entirely through genetic analysis rather than traditional fossil identification, discovered from a bone fragment small enough to lose in a coat pocket. Subsequent research has found that Denisovan DNA shows up in meaningful concentrations in certain modern human populations, particularly in Melanesian and some Southeast Asian populations who carry significantly higher percentages of Denisovan ancestry than populations elsewhere in the world, suggesting Denisovans and the ancestors of these specific modern populations interbred in some now difficult to precisely trace region of Asia, likely multiple times across an extended period. One particularly fascinating genetic contribution traced back to Denisovans involves a gene variant found in modern Tibetan populations that provides enhanced ability to function effectively at extremely high altitude, exactly the kind of specific environmental adaptation you'd expect a distinct human species to have developed after living and adapting to a particular challenging environment over an extended evolutionary timescale, and exactly the kind of adaptation that turned out to be genuinely useful once it got passed down into modern human populations facing similar environmental challenges. Let's bring up something genuinely strange that connects these two species directly together. In 2018, researchers analyzing a bone fragment from Denisova Cave discovered something that frankly, sounds almost too convenient to be real. A direct first-generation Neanderthal Denisovan hybrid, an individual whose mother was Neanderthal and whose father was Denisovan. This single discovery, nicknamed Denny by researchers, provided direct, unambiguous proof that these two distinct human species weren't just occasionally interbreeding with Homo sapiens separately, they were also interbreeding directly with each other, in the same general region, around the same general time period. This paints a genuinely vivid, almost unsettling picture of what certain parts of ancient Eurasia must have actually looked like. Multiple distinct human species living in close enough proximity, and with enough overlapping social contact, to be regularly forming relationships and producing offspring across species lines. Now let's head somewhere geographically very different, and bring in one of the most genuinely bizarre human species discoveries in the entire field. Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit, discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores in 2003. This species stood roughly 3.5 feet tall as a fully grown adult with a brain considerably smaller than modern humans, smaller, in fact, than what researchers would typically expect based purely on extrapolating from body size alone using standard comparative models. Despite this small brain size, evidence suggests these hobbits used stone tools and successfully hunted, including evidence of hunting prey considerably larger than themselves, which raises genuinely fascinating, still actively debated questions about exactly how much raw brain volume actually correlates with sophisticated behavioral capability in the first place. The leading explanation for Homo floresiensis's small size involves something called island dwarfism, a well-documented evolutionary phenomenon where larger animal species isolated on islands with limited resources and reduced predator pressure tend to evolve progressively, smaller body sizes across generations, since smaller bodies require fewer calories to maintain in a resource-constrained island environment. This same general pattern has been documented in other island-isolated species too. Certain island-dwelling elephant populations evolved into genuinely tiny versions of their mainland ancestors through this exact mechanism, so finding it apparently affecting a human lineage too isn't entirely without precedent, even though it remains a genuinely striking, almost surreal example once you actually picture an entire isolated human population gradually shrinking across countless generations on a single, remote island. Here's the detail that should make your jaw drop a little if it hasn't already. Current dating evidence suggests Homo floresiensis may have survived on Flores until somewhere around 50,000 years ago, meaning this tiny, isolated human species was potentially still alive, at almost exactly the same time Homo sapiens was actively spreading through that same general region of the world. We may have quite literally shared this planet with 3.5-foot tall humans within a time frame that, on a deep evolutionary scale, is essentially yesterday. Let's bring in another genuinely fascinating, more recently discovered species, Homo naledi, identified from remains found in the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa, first described scientifically in 2015. Homo naledi had a notably small brain, comparable in size to some much earlier human ancestors, combined, confusingly, with certain skeletal features that look considerably more modern and human-like than you'd expect to find paired with such a small brain. What makes this species particularly fascinating and genuinely controversial within the field is evidence suggesting the remains were deliberately placed deep within an extremely difficult-to-access cave chamber, a location requiring genuinely challenging navigation even for modern researchers equipped with proper caving gear and lighting. Some researchers have proposed this represents deliberate, intentional burial behavior, which would suggest a species with a notably small brain may have still been capable of some form of ritualized treatment of their dead, a genuinely significant claim that, if confirmed through continued research, would meaningfully challenge assumptions connecting brain size directly to behavioral and possibly even symbolic complexity. Now let's bring in Homo erectus, a species that deserves enormous credit for sheer staying power alone, having existed for somewhere around 2 million years, making it, by a significant margin, one of the longest surviving human species we currently know of, dwarfing Homo sapiens' current run by an absolutely enormous margin. Homo erectus successfully spread across an enormous geographic range, from Africa all the way through significant portions of Asia, demonstrating genuine adaptability across wildly different climates and environments. Evidence suggests Homo erectus likely controlled fire, used increasingly sophisticated tools, and may have undertaken some of the very first deliberate sea crossings in human evolutionary history, reaching islands that would have required intentional water travel to access. Homo erectus essentially represents the foundational success success story underlying most of what later human species, including us, eventually built upon, and its sheer evolutionary longevity should probably get discussed considerably more often than it actually does in popular conversations about human evolution. Let's also bring up Homo luzonensis, a genuinely recent discovery identified from remains found in the Philippines, first formally described in 2019, adding yet another distinct branch to an already genuinely crowded human family tree. This species shows a fascinating combination of features, some appearing notably more primitive, others appearing surprisingly modern, a combination that doesn't map cleanly onto any single existing evolutionary narrative researchers had previously settled on. The continued discovery of entirely new human species this recently, well into the 21st century, tells us something genuinely important about the current state of this entire field. We almost certainly haven't found everyone yet. The human family tree researchers are actively mapping out right now likely still has entire branches waiting to be discovered, sitting quietly in caves or sediment layers somewhere, waiting for the right excavation at the right location. Let's address a question that probably deserves direct attention at this point. With this many distinct human species apparently existing, sometimes simultaneously, across overlapping regions and time periods, why exactly did Homo sapiens end up as the only one left standing? This remains a genuinely active, ongoing area of scientific debate rather than a single, settled, universally agreed upon answer. Several overlapping theories have been proposed. Direct competition for shared resources, where Homo sapiens may have simply outcompeted other human species in specific ecological niches. Climate change disrupting environments that other human species had become specifically narrowly adapted to over extended periods, disease transmission between species following increased contact, and even direct conflict in certain specific contexts. The honest, most scientifically responsible answer is that the actual explanation likely varies considerably, depending on the specific species and specific region in question. Neanderthal extinction in Europe may have involved a meaningfully different combination of factors compared to whatever specifically happened to the small, isolated Homo floresiensis population on Flores, and lumping every other human species extinction into one single, universal explanation oversimplifies what was very likely a complex, regionally varied set of separate historical processes. There's also a genuinely important, somewhat uncomfortable point worth raising directly here. Framing this entire topic purely as why did sapiens win risks implying some kind of clean, decisive evolutionary triumph when the actual genetic evidence tells a considerably messier, more intertwined story. These other human species didn't simply vanish, leaving Homo sapiens as some kind of pure, unmixed evolutionary victor standing alone. Significant portions of their genetic material persisted and continue to persist today, woven directly into the genomes of billions of currently living humans. In a genuinely meaningful sense, Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't go fully extinct at all. They were partially absorbed, genetically, into the very same species that ultimately outlasted them as a fully distinct, separately classified lineage. Let's touch on something genuinely fascinating connecting this entire topic to ongoing, active scientific research. The concept of ghost lineages, genetic signatures detected within modern human DNA that don't clearly match any currently identified human species, Neanderthal, Denisovan, or otherwise. Researchers analyzing certain modern population genomes have identified genetic traces suggesting interbreeding with additional, currently unidentified human populations. Evolutionary ghosts detectable only through their lingering genetic fingerprint, with no corresponding fossil evidence yet discovered to definitively confirm exactly which specific, distinct human species that genetic contribution actually came from. This strongly suggests our current picture of ancient human diversity, as genuinely expansive as it already is, remains meaningfully incomplete. There are very likely entire additional human species hiding within our own genetic code that we haven't yet been able to properly identify or formally classify. There's also a genuinely fascinating angle worth bringing into this discussion involving Homo heidelbergensis, a species that's sometimes overlooked in popular conversations about ancient human diversity, despite playing a genuinely important role in the broader evolutionary picture. Homo heidelbergensis is widely considered by many researchers to be a likely common ancestor connecting to both Neanderthals and possibly Denisovans on one branch, and potentially contributing to the lineage eventually leading toward Homo sapiens on another, existing roughly somewhere between 700,000 and 300,000 years ago across parts of Africa and Europe. This species shows evidence of increasingly sophisticated tool use, organized group hunting behavior, and some of the earliest known evidence of deliberate shelter construction within the broader human evolutionary record. Understanding species like Homo heidelbergensis matters enormously for this entire topic because it highlights something genuinely important. The human family tree isn't simply a single, neat line with occasional branches splitting off. It's closer to a genuinely tangled, repeatedly diverging, and sometimes reconverging network, with species splitting apart, adapting separately to different regions and pressures, and in several documented cases, eventually coming back into contact and interbreeding after potentially hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolutionary development. Let's also bring up something genuinely important regarding how researchers actually go about confirming a newly discovered fossil represents a genuinely distinct species, rather than simply unusual individual variation within an already known species, because this distinction matters enormously and isn't always immediately obvious from a single bone fragment alone. Paleoanthropologists typically look for a consistent combination of multiple distinct skeletal features, differences in skull shape, tooth structure, limb proportions that show up reliably across multiple individual specimens, rather than relying on just one unusual individual that might simply represent natural variation, injury, or developmental abnormality within an existing, already recognized species. This is part of why genuinely confirming a new human species discovery often takes years, sometimes decades, of careful comparative analysis, additional fossil discoveries, and rigorous peer review before the broader scientific community reaches anything resembling solid consensus, and it's also exactly why some proposed species classifications remain genuinely contested and actively debated within the field, rather than being immediately universally accepted the moment an initial discovery gets published. There's also a genuinely interesting angle connecting this entire topic to cultural and technological comparison between these different species, because the assumption that Homo sapiens was simply uniformly more advanced across every measurable category turns out to be considerably less clear-cut than popular imagination often assumes. Neanderthals independently developed their own distinct stone tool tradition, sometimes referred to as Mousterian technology, sophisticated enough that it remained genuinely competitive with early Homo sapiens tool technology for an extended period of direct, overlapping coexistence. Evidence of Neanderthal use of pigments, personal ornamentation, and potentially even simple string or cordage production has continued accumulating in recent years, gradually chipping away at the older, considerably more dismissive assumption that Neanderthals were simply technologically and cognitively inferior across the board compared to Homo sapiens. This doesn't mean every other human species matched Homo sapiens in every single capability. Clear differences certainly existed, but the actual picture is considerably more nuanced and considerably less one-sided than the old, simplistic, smart humans replaced dumb cavemen narrative ever managed to capture. Let's also touch on something genuinely fascinating regarding how climate change specifically affected different human species in measurably different ways, because this adds important nuance to the extinction question we addressed earlier. Ice Age climate fluctuations created repeated cycles of habitat expansion and contraction across Eurasia, and species that had become narrowly specialized to a specific, relatively stable climate niche faced considerably greater extinction risk during these fluctuations compared to more behaviorally and dietarily flexible species capable of adapting their subsistence strategy across a wider range of changing environmental conditions. Some researchers studying Neanderthal extinction specifically have pointed to evidence suggesting Neanderthal populations may have relied more heavily on specific large-game hunting strategies that became considerably less viable as certain prey populations declined or shifted their range during particularly severe climate fluctuations toward the end of their existence as a distinct species, while Homo sapiens populations in the same general region show evidence of a broader, more flexible diet incorporating a wider range of food sources, potentially providing a meaningful survival advantage precisely during the kind of environmental instability that seems to have coincided closely with Neanderthal decline. It's also worth addressing something genuinely important regarding population size and genetic diversity, because smaller, more isolated populations face inherently greater extinction risk, regardless of any specific competitive disadvantage compared to another species entirely. Genetic analysis of Neanderthal remains has consistently suggested suggested relatively low overall population size. And genetic diversity, compared to estimates for early Homo sapiens populations during the same general time period, smaller populations are generally more vulnerable to the cumulative effects of inbreeding, reduced ability to adapt to new selective pressures, and basic demographic bad luck, random fluctuations in birth and death rates that can meaningfully threaten a small population's long-term viability, even without any direct external competitive pressure being involved at all. This adds yet another layer of nuance to the extinction question, suggesting at least part of the explanation may come down to ancient Neanderthal populations simply having been more demographically fragile from the start, rather than the entire story being purely about direct competition or conflict with an incoming expanding Homo sapiens population. Finally, it's worth touching on how this entire topic continues actively evolving in genuinely real time, with new discoveries and genetic techniques regularly reshaping scientific understanding even within just the past several years. Improved methods for extracting and analyzing genetic material from increasingly degraded ancient fossil remains have allowed researchers to study specimens that would have been considered far too damaged or too old to yield usable genetic information, even a decade ago. And this technological progress shows no signs of slowing down. Every year brings continued refinement to this entire picture, sometimes confirming existing theories with stronger evidence, sometimes introducing entirely new complications or surprising findings that force researchers to meaningfully revise previous assumptions. This means whatever genuinely complete, definitive answer eventually emerges regarding exactly how many distinct human species once existed, and exactly how and why each one of them eventually disappeared as a separately classified lineage, is very likely still being actively written, one careful excavation and one increasingly sophisticated genetic analysis at a time. So did other human species exist? Not only did they exist, they existed in genuinely substantial numbers across an enormous geographic range, for a length of time that dramatically dwarfs how long Homo sapiens has currently been the planet's sole remaining human species. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, Homo erectus, Homo luzonensis, and very likely several additional species we either haven't discovered yet or have only detected indirectly through ghost genetic signatures, all represent genuine, distinct branches of our own evolutionary family tree, several of which directly overlapped with Homo sapiens in both time and geography, and at least some of which we know with absolute genetic certainty we directly interbred with. And maybe the single most important takeaway buried within this entire story is this: being the only human species currently walking around on Earth isn't some natural default state our genus has always existed in. It's a genuinely recent, genuinely unusual historical anomaly. For the overwhelming majority of our genus's multi-million-year history, multiple human species existed simultaneously, sharing the planet, competing over the same resources, occasionally interbreeding directly with each other, and slowly, unevenly, sorting themselves out across an enormous stretch of evolutionary time until, for reasons that almost certainly varied considerably from species to species and region to region, only one branch of that once genuinely crowded family tree ultimately remained standing to actually tell the story.